Welcome to podcast Hubungan Internasional. This podcast is produced by the Department of International Relations Universitas Gadjah Mada. In today's podcast, we will talk about climate change in the context of Africa. In this podcast, we will have a guest who will also be our guest lecturer for the Economic Development in Africa class, Dr. Daniel Pats. Hi, welcome to Political Economy of Africa class. I am Trevi
and I'm Irfan.
And in this podcast, we will talk about Africa and climate change. We will explore climate change more specifically in the lens of economic development perspective. And for today's session, we are delighted to host this session with Dr. Daniel Pats, who will also be our guest lecturer for the synchronous class session. So, Daniel, he has served as a researcher on natural disaster and also climate change issues with the Brookings Institution. And also, he finished his PhD on climate ethics at University of Graz, which makes him an excellent guest for our session. So, hi Daniel.
Hi Daniel.
Hi,
glad to have you, Daniel.
Hi Irfan, thank you very much for having me, and I'm looking forward to discussing issue of climate change in Africa with you and the students today.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, our pleasure, Daniel. And maybe I will start our discussion today with a question. When we talk about climate change, what do we have in mind? Extreme drought, rise of sea levels, temperature rise, and etc., which we have experienced as of now, right?
Yeah, well, we could obviously talk long and broad about climate change and spend a whole day to talk about science and everything, but let me sum it up very briefly. Mm-hmm. What we know is that the use of fossil fuels such as coal, natural gas and oil since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution about 200 years ago have led to emissions of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane, which warm our atmosphere. This has so far heated global average temperatures by more than 1 degree Celsius. And also this doesn't sound like much in historical timescales. Such a rise of temperatures within just 1 or 2 centuries is really unprecedented. Usually it takes 10,000s, if not millions of years for temperatures to rise 1 or 2 degrees. So this has forced large changes in weather and precipitation patterns. And this in turn makes many natural disasters, such as floods, storms, and droughts worse. And it also has a range of effects, such as rising sea level and the acidification of oceans. So these changes all have an impact on many natural and human systems and activities in turn, such as agriculture, which crops grow, how much they grow, and how well they can grow. Fishing, on health, it impacts definitely also our infrastructure and such human patterns as migration and so on. So it has a lot of impacts on very different fields and sectors all around the world.
Wow, that's quite a lot of impacts that climate change have on our everyday lives. But today, since we are talking about Africa and also the economic development, what do you think makes Africa is interesting as a continent to study more and delve more about when it comes to climate change?
Well, there's one simple reason is that we know from science that Africa is going to be one of the continents that is going to be most affected by climate change. So in that regard, it is very important to talk about what impacts climate change will have on life and the economy in Africa.
So Daniel, if we turn our discussion back to relation between economic development and climate change, how has economic development caused climate change? in your opinion, Daniel?
Well, we already said before that our economic activities, driving, producing things, producing electricity, transportation, they are causing the emission that drive climate change. But we have to know, if you look at Africa, it is really the continent globally that contributes the least to global warming in both an absolute and per capita terms.
Interesting. Is there any number for that?
Well, the African share of global greenhouse gas emissions is about 3.8%. Also, it has more than 17% of the world's population. This compares to the largest emitters like China, the United States, and the European Union, which accounts respectively for 23%, 19%, and 13% of global emissions. So even like if you compare it to Indonesia, Indonesia has about 1.4% of global emissions, so not much less than the whole continent of Africa actually has.
Yeah.
So if you look at it like in terms of what one person, for example, emits per year, someone in Ethiopia, for example, would have to emit 120 years of carbon emissions until he would have the emissions that one average American spends in 1 year.
Oh, that's possible.
You wouldn't live that longer though.
So we can say that there is a major injustice here, given that economic development has clearly caused climate change all around the world, but economic development in Africa has contributed only very, very little to the problem. And we know the history. Many Western countries, they have exploited Africa through colonialism, through terms of trades after the end of colonialism. Basically, have used Africa for their own economic development. And in that process, they have caused a lot of carbon emissions, and they are responsible basically for climate change. So basically, they are responsible for both underdevelopment in Africa and the impacts of climate change that might further hold economic development in Africa back now.
That's very compelling point, Daniel, I think, about development and then climate change in Africa. But then, how does or will climate change affect economic development in the context of Africa?
First, I think I always like to challenge the framing of the debate a little bit, as I'm not too comfortable to discussing climate change in terms of economic development only. I mean, basically, climate change has a lot to do with capitalism, and particularly this paradigm of constant GDP growth, that our economies have to grow every year, are actually one of the major reasons why climate change has gotten out of hand in the first place. So if we want to get climate change in check, I think we need to think differently about development and growth, and need to do different frames, such as human development, for example, that does not base development only on economic growth, but also on other indicators, such as how do we do in terms of health, how do we do in terms of education, how do we do in terms of equality, and so on. So I think we need to look at it more holistically. But to look at like Africa specifically, or the climate impacts in general, I think one of the possible frames to discuss likely climate change impact is in terms of risk. Here we can conceptualize risk through a formula where we have exposure to hazards from climate change on the one hand. There we can estimate how much each region or country might be impacted by changes from climate change, such as like how much more floods, how much more droughts, how much more sea level rise each country, each place will have to see. But this is definitely not everything, because how bad the impacts from climate change will be, it depends very much on which vulnerabilities these hazards meet. And there, most countries in Africa face, unfortunately, many vulnerabilities. Just to name a few, most African countries have large agricultural sectors when it comes to how many people are employed in agriculture. And agriculture is also one of the most vulnerable sectors in terms of climate change, because it depends so much on how the weather, how the climate is. Thus, compared to, for example, more developed countries where maybe 1 to 2% of the population work in the agricultural sector, climate change might impact many more people in many African countries. Vulnerabilities can also be based on specific characteristics of a person and their life cycle. For example, children are much more vulnerable to natural disasters, as are old people. Again, here Africa has a very young population, which might make some disaster impacts worse. Then, again, vulnerabilities can also be compounded by bad infrastructure, by poverty, by inequality, by discrimination, by health issues of the population, by the question if there are conflicts and so on. So there is a lot that is packed into kind of this term of vulnerability. And unfortunately, on many of these indicators, many African countries do not fare very well. Thus, risk from climate change impacts might be very high in many African countries. Then there's still a certain element when it comes to determining risk, which is adaptive capacity. Here we look at how societies might adapt to those changes brought by climate change and being able to minimize the risk. So while in terms of risk, we want to minimize exposure and vulnerability, we want as high adaptive capacity as possible. Here, again, problematic. Adaptive capacity is very low in many African countries. Adaptive capacity can be determined by looking at governance, for example, corruption levels, the level of human resources in a country, the level of technological development, how good scientific institutions, universities, schools are, how strong civil society is, and.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, Daniel, to look at the development not only in terms of economic, but also more holistically. And you mentioned before about the people, you mentioned about the vulnerability, and also how the adaptive capacity of the country itself. When we look in the context of Africa as a continent, we all want to keep the level of global warming as low as possible. But I just want to know, like, if you see how bad it's actually going to be for Africa. Like you mentioned before, Africa is one of the continents that will impacted by climate change, like really badly. But like how bad it is actually going to be given the previous factors that you mentioned about the holistic perspective on development?
Well, that is a good and also a very tricky question because it will very much depend on how much warming we are going to see.
Yeah.
The more we control global warming and keep additional warming low, the less risk we are going to have. So here we need to be aware that climate change is not going to proceed linearly, but because of tipping points in the climate system, once we reach certain thresholds, such as, for example, the melting of the Arctic ice sheet or the bleaching of coral reefs, we will not be able to go back to the state that we were in before, and things might get bad faster because of negative feedback loops in the climate system. So what is going to determine a lot how the future will unfold is how well Africa will be able to adapt to climate change. Again, here, very much it depends on how hot it's going to get. For certain sectors or systems, once we reach certain amounts of warming, for example, 3 or 4 degrees, adaptation will be almost impossible. But if we stay among like what the Paris Agreement says, like 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, much adaptation will still be possible. So this is gonna obviously cost a lot of money and need a lot of resources. There was, for example, a recent study that showed that if we do not mitigate climate change by 2070, up to 2.5 billion people might live in areas where it might be too hot to live at all, including much of the Sahel zone, East and West Africa. Yeah, this is quite dramatic. But even less dramatically, global warming will have strong impacts on water availability and supply and agricultural yields, and thus on food security and employment in Africa. So we will need a lot of adaptation in those sectors, even if the warming stays below 1.5 or 2 degrees of climate change.
Yeah, if that scenario is taking place, I think that was very bad, Daniel.
Yes, So that's why mitigation, so the cutting of greenhouse gas emissions is really important and paramount. But again, we have to remind ourselves, African countries are only producing very low levels of emissions globally at the moment. So mitigation at this moment is less important for African countries because it really needs to happen in the high emitting countries, particularly the Western countries like the United States, European Union, but also like developing countries that have high emissions such as China and growingly also India. This is only very small parts in the hands of African governments, and we really need global solutions and everybody needs to help. Yeah? But still, I mean, it doesn't mean that African countries should not do anything in terms of cutting greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah? So if transitioning to green energy, particular solar energy, might have a lot of benefits for African countries, including better energy availability in remote areas, minimizing fossil fuel imports, so it can save a lot of money for like the budget of those countries and the consumers. We will have lesser air pollution with greener energy. With the gains in technologies, it can create jobs, and etc. And anyway, we will need to reach global zero emissions by about 2050. That also counts for African countries, even if they might have a bit more time and a bit more room to grow their emissions still compared to rich Western industrialized countries, yeah, if you look at it fairly. But there's also one sector where African countries can play an important role, quite similar to Indonesia, is in minimizing deforestation and being cautious about land use changes. Yeah? Forests are huge carbon sinks, and if we can take care of our forests and do not burn the forests and even grow new forests, it can help us a lot in minimizing climate change. Yeah? Wildfires are, as in Indonesia, a big problem and can lead to large spikes in emissions. That's why forest management is very important.
I see. Yeah, I think that is very important. And now I think we start to see the similarities of Indonesia as a country and also Africa as a continent, which has some parts has similar geographical features. For example, you talk about the forest and how African countries and also Indonesia can contribute to lessen the world to get like warmer or hotter by better forest management. I think it's also interesting that Daniel also note that the climate change is now, as we are discussing, is not about only, geographical or biological changes, but also it's about, like how it impacts vulnerable communities and also how African countries, which actually contribute a little to this situation, but impacted a lot by the global warming. We start to talk about like the climate justice. And I think that's a really great discussion. And I want to know, like, when we talk about transition to green energy and also forest management and such to better make the climate change not getting like hotter and warmer every year, how do you see the capacity of African countries to play that role?
Well, as we've seen, we already talked about mitigation, so cutting down, minimizing greenhouse gas emissions so that warming slows down or that we can stop global warming at a certain level already before. But I think what is especially important for Africa, we said, is like kind of adapting to climate change and to investing into climate change adaptation, yeah? Because it will be so much impacted in terms of very many different sectors. So we really need to reduce these vulnerabilities and to improve the adaptive capacity of African countries. So many African countries have already quite some things going for them. Generally, we have seen relatively strong economic growth in many African countries in recent years, and also rises in life expectancy and a quite significant fall in extreme poverty. So these are positive developments. And hopefully, if countries can sustain these developments, it might help African societies to become more resilient to some of the climate impacts. Also, many African countries have a very young and dynamic population. So this might also help to make the transition to a post-carbon economy faster, as young people might be more easy to adapt to new ways and new methods of doing things. We also see strong urbanization in many African countries. If that can be managed well in terms of planning and risk management, this might also positively contribute to economic development and to lessening vulnerabilities to climate change. But for sure, African countries might not be able to cope with all the climate impacts by themselves. And they should also not be left alone, given that they are hardly responsible for causing climate change. Yeah, that's where in the realm of climate justice. Yeah, so you haven't caused much of the problem, but you have a lot of impacts. So we really need the rich countries to step up to support African countries, particularly when it comes to supporting a green transition and adaptation. So there are studies that show that the cost of adaptation due to past emissions are between $7 to $15 billion per year by 2020, and they can rise as much to like $35 billion per year by 2050. So this is a lot of money that obviously most African countries do not have on the side. So that's why we need, like, also part of the Paris Treaty is like climate finance, so that rich and developed countries support poorer and developing countries in kind of dealing with the impacts of climate change. And aside from money, obviously what also is needed is, like, we need a lot of research, because there's still a lot we need to learn on how we can best adapt in each sector, in agriculture, in transportation, in water management, in dealing with forests and mangroves and so on, how we can deal best with the climate impacts. Again, there I think Western countries have a huge moral responsibility and should fulfill their responsibilities to help African countries to learn how to adapt best to climate impacts.
I think many things to do in terms of Africa as a continent, many things to do so they can adapt toward the climate change that's happening now. But in our earlier discussion, Daniel, you have mentioned at least two scenarios of climate change in Africa, maybe hypothetics between 1.5 and 2 Celsius degrees rise in temperature, or 3 to 4 rise in temperature in that scenario. What would be the result of those scenarios in both scenarios, Daniel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a high emission scenario, a high climate change scenario, not only for Africa, but particularly for Africa, because what we have to know is like that climate change impacts are going to be particularly hard in the tropical and subtropical areas. I think we might see really catastrophic outcomes. As we see before with this research, large parts of Africa with 3 to 4 degrees of warming might become almost uninhabitable. We might see failed states, mass poverty, hunger, and mass migration from and within the African continent. On the other hand, I mean, if we really manage to stay within 1.5, 2 degrees of warming, doesn't mean that everything is going to be perfect. We will see strong impacts. But if we keep global warming limited, then African countries might use the chance to get ahead of the curve with a green transition and smartly invest in mitigation and adaptation, catching up with other parts of the world in the next couple of decades. And the final result then will likely be somewhere, the final result is likely going to be somewhere between those poles. And it really also very much depends on how single countries manage to deal with vulnerabilities and how they develop their adaptive capacity. So we might also see large differences, obviously, in terms of how different countries geographically and in terms of development will manage climate change. Yeah? We know that climate change is in a big part going to be a risk multiplier. So countries that are on a positive trajectory in terms of governments and human development right now will likely be able to do better in terms also of dealing with climate change, while countries that are struggling will find life even harder because of climate change. Let's look at the number of development and initiatives that can point towards the positive scenario now, which might also give us some lessons on how to deal with climate change from African countries.
Yeah, I think I've read somewhere, or I think I've seen a poster, or I don't know. I remember I saw that some African countries have actually starting transition to green energy, and they do much better than Indonesia. Can you please, I don't know, like, because I forgot which country it was and how it's actually the development of green energy happening in African countries. I'm not sure. I think it's Kenya or
Yes, indeed. Yeah, one of the, I think, shining examples is really Kenya, which has put massive efforts in like changing its electricity system to green energy. It's from renewable energy, and like the target is to reach like a full 100% of electricity from renewable energy by the early 2020s. So in the next couple of years already. Already in 2018, the country has managed 70% of its electricity from renewable sources. Yeah, I mean, it's a bit sad to say, but if you compare it with Indonesia, Indonesia currently only has about 12% of its electricity from renewable energy, and also the target for Indonesia is, I think, about 23% in 2030, so much, much lower and less ambitious. So if you compare it even, I mean, Kenya's GDP is only less than half of that of Indonesia. So that shows that countries that are much less developed than Indonesia can make this green transition relatively fast. So yeah, I think that's a very good example to show that some African countries are really using the opportunity kind of to jump ahead. And I think this is kind of one thing that we should see for like many developing countries. There is like climate change can also be an opportunity. Yeah? So if you invest fast in green energy, you save a lot of money, you gain new technology that you can then sell on to other countries, and you can help other countries to also develop fast. Yeah?
Wow, that's, I think, very great lesson from Africa that we have. If we put our attention on climate change issue, it can also be an opportunity for our economy to grow, because if we invent technology that can adapt to this problem, then we can sell it to other countries that need it. I think it would be great, right, Daniel, if Indonesia can learn from that experience.
Yes, I think it should. And I think there is like really kind of, I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting projects also in terms of adaptation. For example, you know, in the Sahel zone, like transitioning from the Sahara, it's very dry, and like a lot of problems with water and availability. And there's another great initiative here, for example, called the Great Green Wall of Africa, where more than 20 African countries together with the African Union are working together to build like a wall of like 8,000 kilometers of forests and trees to stop like the Sahara Desert from encroaching even more into like kind of the Sahel zone, and to improve agriculture and water availability. So far, 15% of the project has been completed. So, I mean, it's one other example. But back to your point here, there are, I mean, and I hope that's something we can also discuss more now in this class. We should like, I think there's like kind of maybe a temptation to kind of sometimes look down on Africa because it's in over on average maybe a bit less developed now than Indonesia. But I think there's a lot of similarities. Number one, in terms of the hazards that countries face, because like many African countries lie in the same climate zone as Indonesia. Yeah, so like extreme weather, sea level rise. In terms of hazards, there are a lot of the same problems, but also the same. Some of the same opportunities in terms of solar energy, renewable energies, geothermal energies, and so on. So there's a lot of actually possible cooperation that also could take place. Also, as we have noted, like the forestry sector, yeah, many African countries also have large scales of tropical rainforests. Deforestation is a problem. So I think there are a lot of similarities here, and I think it might be really interesting to think and brainstorm a little bit about the similarities, but also the differences in terms of climate change risks and opportunities that we have between Indonesia and African countries, and also to think about actually where Indonesia could cooperate. African countries learn from Indonesian experience, or Indonesia also learn from the experiences of some African countries.
Yeah, I think that is a great sum of our discussion, and we would like to end this series of discussion that we have with Daniel and also
Mm-hmm.
Irfan with two main questions. As we talk about Africa and also Indonesia, can you see like any parallels or maybe differences between Indonesia and Africa in how we handle mitigation and also adaptation? And maybe if, like it's a food for thought for our audience here, in what areas do you think Indonesia and maybe African countries we can cooperate and also learn from each other in terms of climate change policy? So I think those are two things that are important for us like to discuss. And as we hear from Daniel, we might see a lot of things that is open for collaborations maybe and cooperations between Indonesia and African countries. So thank you very much, Daniel, for your time, and also Irfan.
Yeah.
It was very fun to have the discussion with you about this issue, which might not be the key priority for like many people, like climate change. When we still have like many problems, maybe not that many people put it as their main consideration. But when we see that there is the issue of climate justice, how we, like as an individual might contribute actually very little to that global warming, but we experience the impact greatly, that becomes an issue for us all. So thank you very much, and
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for joining our session today, Daniel.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to our podcast today. And hopefully to see you in class for our students. And hopefully this podcast can also be a food for thought for everyone else that listens to this series of podcasts. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Bye.